What if I told you that 1/3 of humanity simply vanished? That corpses were left rotting in the streets, and burning your neighbor was seen as an act of salvation? And that all of this actually happened? This isn't a horror movie. It's the true story of the deadliest pandemic in history, the Black Death. A tragedy that began with a rat, spread through ships, and plunged Europe into blood, panic, and eerie silence. In this documentary, you'll discover how the world spiraled into chaos, and why, even 7 centuries later, the threat is far from over. If you're drawn to dark, intense, and true stories, hit play, because the end of the world has already happened once. Before the scream, there's always a whisper, and in the case of the Black Death, the whisper began long before the first corpse fell. It echoed through crowded markets, silent churches, and cold stone castles. It was the sound of an unprepared Europe. In the early 14th century, the continent seemed stable, perhaps even full of promise. Cities were expanding, trade routes bustled with activity, and the population had reached heights not seen since the Roman Empire. But beneath this fragile prosperity lay invisible cracks and dormant dangers. Peasants, the backbone of the economy, was bound to the land and plagued by hunger. A single failed harvest could mean death for thousands. Agriculture depended entirely on the seasons and on luck. And in the years leading up to the plague, luck began to run dry. The Great Famine of 1315 killed millions and left a trail of bodies in despair across the continent. It was as if the earth itself was warning the worst was yet to come. Meanwhile, medicine was a game of guesswork. Physicians believed health hinged on the balance of 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Illness was seen as divine punishment or spiritual imbalance. There were no bacteria, no hygiene, surgeries were performed without anesthesia. Bloodletting, spells, and prayers, that was all they had. Faith was the foundation of medieval life. The Catholic Church held sway over hearts, minds, and politics. Miracles were more trusted than diagnoses. Heaven was the ultimate goal, and hell a looming threat. But with so much suffering already in the world, people began to wonder, was God still listening? Pre-plague Europe was a land of contradictions. Commercial growth marched alongside scientific ignorance. Cathedrals rose to the heavens while filth piled in the streets. Men prayed for protection, never imagining what was drawing near, because something was already on its way, invisible, silent, and when it arrived, it wouldn't ask permission, it would simply harvest. Not every tragedy begins with a scream. Sometimes it comes hidden in a ship's cargo hold, in a rat's fur, in the bite of a flea. The story of the Black Death doesn't begin in Europe. It starts much earlier, across the vast lands of Central Asia. There, among silk roads and open steppes, invisible bacteria were already reshaping humanity's fate. The name of the killer, Yersinia pestis, a deadly bacteria carried by fleas that lived on wild rodents. For centuries, this plague remained confined to isolated populations. But everything changed with the rise of the Mongol Empire. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the borders between East and West opened like never before. Merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims traveled thousands of kilometers and unknowingly carried the plague with them. In 1347, Genoese ships arrived at the port city of Kaffa in Crimea. They brought spices, textiles, and valuable goods, and something far more dangerous, infected fleas hiding on common rats that lived deep in the ship's holds. Chaos had set sail. When those ships left Kaffa and crossed the Mediterranean towards southern Europe, their course was already sealed. Every port that welcomed them opened a new gateway for death. Messina in Sicily was the first to feel the blow. When the ships docked, the locals were met with a horrifying sight. Feverish sailors covered in dark boils, coughing blood, and dying within days. Authorities tried to drive the ships away, but it was already too late. The plague was spreading faster than any reaction could stop it. And it traveled with brutal efficiency. Where there were people, there were rats. Where there were rats, there were fleas. And where there were fleas, there was plague. The trade routes that once connected the world had become open veins of contagion. From Messina, the disease reached Genoa, Marseille, Pisa, Venice, then moved inland to France, Germany, and Spain. In just over a year, it crossed borders, mountains, and seas. No one was safe. The plague didn't need maps, and it didn't need armies to conquer cities. Only silence, darkness, and time. By the time kings understood what was happening, it was too late. The Silk Road had become the road of death, and Europe was only at the beginning of its nightmare. It was in October of 1347 that Europe first inhaled the breath of death. The port of Messina in Sicily was a bustling hub of commerce. Ships came and went, carrying goods, spices, and the promise of profit. But that morning, when 12 Genoese ships docked, it wasn't the silk or gold that drew attention. It was the silence. The sailors were dying. Some were already dead. Emaciated men, covered in dark blotches, with swollen boils beneath their arms and between their legs. They coughed up blood. They moaned in delirium. And where there had once been life, there was now only the rotten stench of decay. The authorities were horrified. They tried to drive the ships away to order them back to sea, but the plague had already come ashore. It didn't need permission. Just a few rats, a flea or two, and the first breath of contagion had begun. The infected died within days, sometimes within hours. The body would swell, the fever would erupt, organs would fail, and people, in despair, searched for answers and for someone to blame. At first, many believed it was divine punishment. Others blamed witches, Jews, travelers. But the truth was, no one understood what was happening. Medicine had no answers. Priests, exhausted, were burying more than they preached. And the people, they simply fled. But there was nowhere to run. Messina collapsed within weeks. The streets emptied. Church bells tolled endlessly. Grave diggers couldn't keep up. Entire families vanished in silence, locked inside their homes with their dead. And while Messina died, the plague traveled from ship to ship, from town to town, from body to body. That first breath would become a storm, and that storm would soon sweep across an entire continent. Europe had just opened the door to one of the darkest chapters in human history. The plague didn't knock. It slipped in unnoticed, and by the time anyone realized it was there, it was already too late. The Black Death showed no mercy, and perhaps most terrifying of all, it changed faces. The most common form was bubonic plague, spread by the bite of infected fleas. It began with a sudden, violent fever. The body trembled, joints burned. Then came the buboes, dark, swollen lumps in the armpits, groin, or neck, the size of apples. It was as if the body itself was inflating to scream that something was terribly wrong inside. But the plague didn't stop there. The pneumonic form, even deadlier, attacked the lungs. All it took was a cough, a sneeze, a breath in the air. Within hours, the infected would spit blood, lose consciousness, and die gasping for air. No rats or fleas were needed for this version, only tainted air and another person's breath. The third form, septicemic plague, was silent and instant. The infection invaded the bloodstream directly. The skin darkened, the body rotted while still alive. And sometimes, death came before the first symptom. And the worst part, all of this could unfold in under 3 days. Some died the very same day they felt the first signs. It was death without warning. No time, no choice. Entire cities collapsed within weeks. First the sick, then those who cared for them, then those who buried the dead, until no one was left. Homes were sealed with entire families still inside. Priests gave absolution from a distance. Mothers abandoned their children. Brothers betrayed brothers. And the speed of contagion? Unthinkable. The plague followed trade routes, ocean winds, muddy footprints. In 2 years, it had swept through most of Italy, France, Spain, and England. In 5, it would reach Russia, Scandinavia, and North Africa. There were no borders, no walls strong enough. Europe was facing an invisible enemy and an unstoppable one. And the more people fought it, the clearer it became. Society itself was rotting right alongside the corpses. When science fails and the bodies pile up, only one question remains: where is God? For centuries, the Catholic Church had been Europe's moral and spiritual compass. It dictated right from wrong, sin from salvation, and what awaited beyond death. But with the arrival of the plague, even the most devout began to doubt. Prayers seemed powerless. Religious processions spread more disease than hope. And church bells, once symbols of faith, now only announced the next burial. To many, the outbreak was divine punishment, a reckoning for humanity's sins. Lust, greed, vanity, all were being collected. The apocalypse had arrived, and every sneeze felt like a sentence. Women were accused of witchcraft. Jews were tortured and burned under false charges of poisoning wells. Foreigners, beggars, lepers, anyone who looked different became a target. When God is silent, the people scream, and that scream often turns into violence. Fanatical religious movements began to rise. The most infamous, the flagellants, men in cloaks, marching from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public, believing that physical suffering could cleanse the world's sins. Wherever they went, they drew crowds and brought the plague with them. In villages, charms, spells, and fake relics emerged. pieces of the true cross, saints' teeth, vials of Mary's tears, anything that promised protection. Faith became a marketplace. Hope, a rare currency. Meanwhile, priests died by the thousands. Monasteries emptied. In some regions, even the clergy abandoned their parishes, fleeing like any other mortal. After all, how could one preach salvation when it felt like hell had risen to earth? The plague didn't just destroy bodies, it corroded certainty, faith, and authority. And where once stood a unified Christian Europe, there remained a land fractured by fear, suspicion, and divine silence. Because perhaps the greatest terror wasn't death itself, but the possibility that God was no longer listening. The Black Death didn't just topple kings and cathedrals. It also dismantled the fragile framework of medieval medicine, because when the world got sick, the doctors fell with it. In 14th century Europe, being a physician was, above all, a blend of faith, astrology, and tradition. Universities taught medicine based on ancient texts written over 1,000 years earlier by Galen and Hippocrates, as if the world hadn't changed since antiquity. The human body was seen as a vessel of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any illness was explained as an imbalance among them. So when the plague arrived, the first step seemed obvious: let the blood flow. Bloodletting was common, slicing open a patient's skin to release bad fluids. But with the plague, it only hastened death. Others tried to restore balance with extreme diets, prolonged fasting, or bizarre concoctions of vinegar, garlic, urine, and even animal feces. Some believed the stench of the plague could be countered with even fouler smells, and so they burned clothing, corpses, even rare perfumes. Then came the infamous plague doctors, with their long beaked masks, stuffed with aromatic herbs to filter the sick air. It was a futile effort, but an unforgettable image. And the amulets, they spread like wildfire. Tiny bags filled with stones, animal teeth, Bible pages, or scraps of saints' clothing were worn around the neck like magical shields. Doctors prescribed prayers. Astrologers predicted outbreaks based on planetary alignments. Was this medicine or superstition in a white coat? Meanwhile, the real cause of the disease, a microscopic bacteria spread by fleas, went entirely unnoticed. Rats ran freely through streets, markets, homes, and no one linked them to the slaughter. In some cases, doctors simply gave up. They abandoned their patients, locked themselves indoors, fled the city. After all, many realized, to be merely infected was a death sentence. And yet, some died trying to save lives. Many physicians and healers were buried alongside their patients, with their flawed remedies, medieval tools, and courage. The medicine of the time wasn't just ineffective. In many cases, it was complicit in the tragedy. Because when the body collapses and those meant to heal don't even know what to look for, the only treatment left is to pray you're not next. When the world loses control, it looks for someone to blame. And in plague-stricken Europe, that blame fell on the innocent. With death spreading like fire through dry straw, people demanded answers. It wasn't enough to say it was divine punishment or a humoral imbalance. They needed a face, a culprit, a visible enemy. And so came the accusations. In dozens of cities, Jews were the first to be targeted. Rumors spread like wildfire. Claims that they were poisoning wells, conspiring against Christians, summoning dark forces to destroy Europe. There was no evidence. But in chaos, truth is the first casualty. Entire Jewish communities were massacred. Men, women, and children burned alive inside locked synagogues. In Strasbourg, 1349, more than 2,000 Jews were murdered in a single day. Some chose suicide over the hands of the mob. And it didn't stop there. Foreigners, travelers, beggars, lepers, the mentally ill, anyone on society's margins became a target. If you were different, you were dangerous. If you were poor, you were guilty. If you prayed differently, you were a heretic. But hysteria turned into policy. To calm the people and protect their power, rulers sanctioned lynchings. Entire communities were expelled. Many went into hiding. Others fled. Few escaped. And some truly believed they were doing good. Burning a Jewish village was purifying evil. Killing a stranger was saving the town. Fear warped morality. Ignorance justified hatred. And all of it under one cruel irony. The plague did not choose its victims. Jews, Christians, rich, poor, all died the same way. Yet still, thousands were sacrificed for crimes they never committed, not by the plague, but by humanity. The Black Death left behind a trail of corpses, but it also left deeper scars. Scars on conscience, on justice, on compassion, because in the end, the disease exposed more than medical failure. It revealed the darkest side of those who survived. Imagine walking through a city with no voices, no laughter, no footsteps, only the sound of the wind and the echo of a civilization brought to a halt. That was Europe between 1347 and 1351. In just 4 years, the Black Death wiped out between 1/3 and half of the continent's entire population. Estimates point to over 75 million deaths worldwide, at least 25 million in Europe alone. But the numbers alone don't tell the full story. It's what was left behind that screams the loudest. Entire villages vanished from the map. Abandoned homes, empty churches, untended fields. In some regions, there was no one left to bury the dead or to mourn them. Whole families were erased from history. Surnames disappeared. Bloodlines ended. In cities like Florence, Paris, London, and Venice, population density plummeted. Entire neighborhoods became makeshift cemeteries. The streets were filled with silence and with bodies. Commerce came to a halt. The once familiar sound of church bells became rare because there was no one left to ring them. In rural areas, the devastation was even greater. With peasants gone, food production collapsed. Fertile land turned to weeds. Domesticated animals roamed free. There was no wheat, no meat, no bread, and suddenly the problem wasn't just dying from plague, but dying from hunger. The few who survived lived surrounded by an emptiness too vast to ignore. Imagine having 1,000 neighbors, and within a month, only 20 remain. Imagine looking at the house next door, knowing no one will ever open that door again. That collective silence changed everything. How people saw life, death, faith, even the value of a human being. Because with so few people left, labor became worth its weight in gold. And that shift would pave the way for a new era, but not without scars. The plague didn't just kill people. It erased communities. It turned cities into open graves and silenced centuries of stories. The world was no longer the same, and those who were still alive had to relearn how to live among ghosts. When it seemed the world had been abandoned by God, some tried to get his attention with blood. With churches filled with corpses and priests collapsing dead at the altar, many believers felt that traditional faith was no longer enough. The usual prayers weren't working. The cross is no longer protected, and the plague kept claiming lives mercilessly, relentlessly. It was in this spiritual void that the flagellants emerged. Men, and sometimes even women, formed processions through towns and villages, dressed in simple robes, barefoot, faces covered. They marched in silence or chanted dark hymns, and in the middle of the streets they whipped themselves with ropes and chains tipped with iron spikes. They did this for days, without rest, without food. They believed that by suffering in the flesh, they were atoning for humanity's sins. If they bled enough, perhaps God would forgive the world. The sight was harrowing. Bloody bodies, cries of pain, prayers soaked in guilt. But to those who witnessed it, surrounded by death and fear, it looked like a divine answer. Crowds followed the flagellants, imitated their rituals, and in doing so helped spread the plague even further. The flagellants answered to no church. Many, in fact, denounced the clergy, accusing priests of corruption and neglect. They created their own doctrine, their own leaders, their own miracles. Other fanatic groups also emerged. Some stormed cities, promising to cleanse sin through violence. Others burned books, destroyed sacred images, and held public trials for heretics. Some claimed to have visions. Others predicted doomsday on specific dates and drew in crowds with promises of instant salvation. It was chaos, dressed as faith. At first, the church hesitated, but soon it saw the danger. Pope Clement VI eventually condemned the flagellants publicly, but it was too late. Fanaticism had broken out of the cathedrals and spilled into the streets, and Europe, drowning in panic, could no longer tell true faith from collective delusion. The plague didn't just kill bodies. It made room for despair to take the throne of reason. And in this new world, where blood was an offering and pain was a prayer, faith was no longer a refuge. It had become a spectacle. The plague didn't end with a miraculous cure or divine intervention. It faded slowly, like a candle dying out when the air runs thin. The most devastated communities emptied out, breaking the cycle of contagion. With no living bodies nearby, death had no one left to dance with. The outbreaks began to lose strength as people gradually adapted to forced isolation, even without understanding the concept of quarantine. Some cities, like Milan, sealed entire houses with the sick still inside. A cruel act, but one that helped stop the spread. But climate played its part too, changing seasons and a natural decline in the flea and rat populations. The true carriers of the plague helped the contagion die down. In some regions, smaller outbreaks reappeared, but never with the same ferocity. When the church bells finally stopped tolling so often, people emerged cautiously into a changed world. When the bells stopped ringing and the psalms turned into laments, art took on a new role, to depict the end of the world through paint, words, and melancholy. Post-plague Europe wasn't just a wounded continent. It was a place where death had become part of daily life, and that was reflected in everything. In music and paintings and books and folk songs, death became a character, a symbol, an obsession. Ravens, birds that circled over corpses in battlefields, became haunting icons of the era. They were everywhere, in imagination, in stories, and legends, even in clothing. The plague doctor masks resembled their long beaks, as if medicine itself had taken the shape of death. Medieval painting, once filled with saints, miracles, and glorious biblical scenes, began to portray macabre dances, corpses walking among the living, shadowy angels and ravenous demons. One of the most recurring themes was the dance macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons led kings, peasants, monks, and children to the grave, all hand in hand. The message was clear: no one escapes. In literature, visceral and poetic accounts emerged. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, told the story of 10 young people fleeing the plague to take refuge in the countryside, telling stories to distract themselves while the world outside collapsed. It was one of the first works to blend the fear of the plague with humor, eroticism, social critique, and hope, a reflection of humanity trying to laugh in the face of tragedy. Music changed too. Folk songs began to speak of pain, loss, and uncertainty. There were songs that told of funerals, farewells, pleas to the heavens. Melodies grew slower, lyrics darker, the tone more resigned. But the greatest shift was in worldview. The plague shattered the idea of stability, of progress, of an unchanging divine order. For the first time in centuries, mankind looked to the sky and doubted, was God still there? Or was everything just chaos? This new mindset laid the foundation for what would come next, the Renaissance. Yes, the plague made room for doubt, but also for curiosity. Science began to challenge dogma. Art began to reflect the human soul. And medieval culture, centered on the divine, gave way to a culture centered on man. In the Raven's wake, a new Europe was born. Darker, more skeptical, but also more aware of life's fragility. When the dust settled, when the last body was buried, when silence became routine, only the survivors remained. But the world around them was no longer the same. The plague had destroyed nearly everything: families, cities, entire cultures. Yet in the void it left behind, a new Europe began to emerge. A Europe shaped not by order, but by scarcity. With millions dead, what was once abundant, people, had become rare. And that triggered a social earthquake. Peasants, once seen as disposable, had become essential. There was a labor shortage for planting, harvesting, building, and serving. And for the first time, the poor held something powerful in their hands: bargaining power. Many feudal lords tried to cling to the old rules, with heavy taxes and forced obligations. But now, the survivors knew their worth. They demanded wages, they demanded land, and if they didn't get it, they simply left, migrating to cities where demand for workers was even greater. This movement forced a radical shift in the class structure. The rural aristocracy began to lose influence. Cities grew. New trades, new employers, new markets emerged. The economy was no longer purely agrarian. It began to urbanize. But the changes didn't stop there. The church, which once held a monopoly over faith, morality, and knowledge, saw its authority crumble. Thousands of priests had died. Many who survived had fled or failed to help. Faith endured, but trust that had been buried with the dead. This opened the door to new ideas, new forms of religiosity, and later, to religious reforms that would forever alter Europe's destiny. Cities also began to reorganize. Wider streets, basic sanitation, still primitive, but improving. Mortality records, quarantines, hospitals. For the first time, society understood it had to prepare for future tragedies, because death had shown it could return at any moment. The plague didn't just destroy, it leveled the social battlefield. And in the ruins, seeds were sown of freedom, mobility, questioning, and gradually, modernity. The Black Death wasn't just an ending. It was a turning point, and those who survived, even draped in mourning, now faced a new world. the Black Death passed, but it never truly left. It left behind more than just graves. It carved lessons into the very skin of Europe, lessons that shaped the centuries to come, even if silently, like a scar hidden beneath clothing. In medicine, the tragedy exposed a brutal truth. The old methods were useless. Blind trust in humor and dogma began to crumble. The suffering brought by the plague forced doctors to observe more, experiment more, question more. New treatises emerged, anatomical manuals appeared, and little by little the human body came to be seen through a scientific lens, not just a spiritual one. Of course, the true medical revolution was still centuries away, but the first step was taken there, in the collapse. In urban planning, cities had to reinvent themselves. The plague revealed that narrow streets, accumulated waste, and dense populations were invisible allies of death. Governments began investing in drainage, garbage collection, open spaces, and sanitary isolation. The concept of quarantine first appeared in Venice. The city required ships to remain anchored for 40 days before allowing anyone to disembark. It was the beginning of modern prevention. And perhaps the most profound impact was on science itself. The collapse of blind faith in religious explanations made room for a new generation of thinkers, eager to understand the world through other means. Thus began the Renaissance spirit, which would soon give rise to geniuses like Da Vinci, Copernicus, and Galileo, all because the plague showed that relying solely on dogma could be deadly. The Black Death also forged the idea of a protective state. For the first time, kings and authorities began to intervene in public health, to create population records, and to care about disease control. It was the start of policies we now see as routine: vaccination, health surveillance, mortality statistics, and it didn't end there. The plague came back, in smaller outbreaks, in new forms, over the centuries, but never again did it catch humanity completely off guard. The collective memory of tragedy became a tool, and fear, curiously, became progress. The legacy of the plague is invisible, yes, but it lives on in every modern hospital, in every wide street, in every surgical mask, in every laboratory, in every effort to keep history from repeating itself. The plague killed millions, but it also forced humanity to live differently. History doesn't repeat itself word for word, but it rhymes, and sometimes it rhymes in blood. In the 21st century, we believed we were immune to the chaos of the past. With modern hospitals, antibiotics, vaccines, and artificial intelligence, it seemed unthinkable that a new plague could catch us off guard. But then, the world stopped. Again, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic reminded us that invisible terror still exists, that all it takes is a virus, an international flight, a week of carelessness, and the entire planet bows. The parallels with the Black Death are chilling. Once again, there was denial. Once again, false cures, conspiracy theories, and misinformation spread. Once again, medicine raced for answers as bodies piled up. Once again, fear revealed both the worst and the best in people. We saw healthcare workers sacrifice themselves. We saw empty cities, closed borders, solitary funerals. We saw the impact on the poor, the collapse of systems, and the vital role of science. And just like in the 14th century, the virus didn't just infect bodies, it tested values, systems, governments, and the very idea of humanity. The great lesson of the Black Death and of modern pandemics is that we are not in control. We live in an interconnected world, biologically and socially fragile, and at all times, we are at the mercy of forces we cannot see, but definitely feel, and still we ignore the warnings. Experts have been sounding the alarm for decades. The deforestation, wildlife trafficking, megacities, and global warming all bring us closer to new health collapses. But only when morning knocks at the door does the world react. Too late. So, what have we learned? Perhaps that science saves, that information is a shield, that solidarity is a vaccine, and that ignoring history is repeating tragedy. The Black Death shaped us. COVID-19 warned us, and the future depends on what we choose to remember. Because in the end, the greatest danger isn't a new virus, it's forgetting that one can come.